Nobody wanted Obese Girl for 10 years, until Mountain Man chose her between 30 women. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square of Independence, Missouri, in the summer of 1817. Martha Henderson stood at the back of the line, her substantial frame wrapped in the only decent dress she owned, a faded blue calico that her mother had let out 3 times to accommodate her growing figure. Around her, 29 other young women preened and primped, adjusting their bonnets and pinching their cheeks to bring color to their faces. This was the 3rd such bride auction Martha had attended in the past decade. The first had been when she was merely 15, still holding on to the foolish hope that some kind soul might see past her considerable girth to the gentle heart that beat beneath. The second had been 3 years later, after her parents' death left her dependent on the grudging charity of her aunt and uncle. Now, at 25, she harbored no illusions. She was here because her uncle had given her an ultimatum: find a husband or find the door. And "Stand straight, girls," called out Reverend Matthews, the organizer of this particular venture. "These men have traveled far and wide, some from as distant as the Oregon Territory, seeking good Christian wives to help them build their homesteads. Present yourselves with dignity." Martha smoothed her dress over her wide hips and tried to ignore the whispers of the other women. She had heard it all before, the barely concealed snickers, the cruel observations about how she'd eat a poor man out of house and home, the predictions that she'd end up a spinster, caring for other women's children until she died alone. The men began arriving on horseback and in wagons, a rough-looking lot weathered by sun and hardship. There were farmers seeking help with their land, trappers looking to settle down, merchants hoping for a partner to mind their stores. They circled the gathered women like buyers at a horse market, and Martha felt her cheeks burn with the familiar shame of being appraised and found wanting. One by one, the prettier girls were chosen. Blonde Sarah Mitchell, barely 18, was claimed by a prosperous-looking rancher within 5 minutes. Dark-haired Rebecca Stone, with her tiny waist and delicate features, had 3 men vying for her hand before she selected a young minister. Even plain Jane Porter, with her unfortunate overbite, was approached by a widower with 4 children who needed a mother. As the morning wore into afternoon, the crowd thinned. 20 women chosen, then 25. Martha remained standing, her feet aching in her too tight boots, her throat dry from the dust and heat. She focused on a point in the distance, willing herself not to cry, not to give the remaining spectators the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Well, I suppose that's everyone," Reverend Matthews said, surveying the nearly empty square. Only Martha and 3 other unfortunate souls remained: an older woman with a severe limp, a girl with a terrible burn scar covering half her face, and a widow rumored to be barren. "Hold on there, Reverend." The voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. Martha looked up to see a man emerging from the shade of the general store's awning. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke. His beard was thick and black, shot through with silver, and his hair hung past his collar. He wore buckskins that had seen better days, and a huge hunting knife hung from his belt alongside a tomahawk. The Reverend's face brightened. Jeremiah Thornton, heard you'd come down from the mountains. Never thought I'd see you at one of these gatherings." "Never thought I'd be here neither," the mountain man rumbled. His eyes, startlingly blue in his weathered face, swept over the 4 remaining women. "But I'm getting old, Reverend. Winters get colder when you're alone. Figure it's time to have someone to talk to besides my mule." Reverend Matthews gestured to the women. "Well, as you can see, these 4 fine ladies are still available. Mrs. Kowalski there is an excellent cook, I'm told, and young Prudence, despite her misfortune, can sew like an angel." But Jeremiah Thornton wasn't looking at Mrs. Kowalski or Prudence. His blue eyes had settled on Martha, and she found she couldn't look away. There was something in his gaze, not pity, not disgust, but a frank assessment, as if he were evaluating her the way he might evaluate a potential hunting partner or a good rifle. "What's your name?" he asked. his voice gentler than she would have expected from such a rough-looking man. "Martha Henderson, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know how to work, Martha Henderson?" "Yes, sir. I can cook, clean, preserve food, tend a garden, sew, and help with butchering and smoking meat. I can read and write and do sums. I'm stronger than I look, and I don't shy from hard labor." A smile tugged at the corner of his bearded mouth. "Stronger than you look? Girl, you look like you could wrestle a bear and come out on top." Martha's face flamed. This was it, the moment when he'd make his joke and move on to one of the others. But instead of laughing cruelly, Jeremiah Thornton continued. That's good. Where I live, up in the Rockies near Bear Creek, strength matters more than a tiny waist. Winters are hard, and the work doesn't stop for delicate sensibilities. Can you handle isolation? Nearest neighbor is a 3-day ride." Martha blinked, uncertain if she'd heard correctly. "You're asking me?" "I'm asking you," he confirmed. "I ain't a rich man, and my cabin's rough, but I've got good land, plenty of game, and I know how to survive. I'd treat you fair and respectful. We'd be partners, equal-like. What do you say?" For a long moment, Martha couldn't speak. 10 years. 10 years of rejection, of being passed over, of watching lesser women be chosen while she stood alone. And now, this mountain man, this stranger who looked like he could snap a man in half with his bare hands, was offering her a chance at a life, at a purpose, at escape from her uncle's contempt. "I say yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Mr. Thornton, I'll marry you." Chapter 2, The Journey. They were married that very afternoon in a brief ceremony conducted by Reverend Matthews. Jeremiah produced a thin gold band that he said had belonged to his mother, and Martha found herself legally bound to a man she'd known for less than 4 hours. "We'll leave at first light," Jeremiah told her after the ceremony. "Got a wagon waiting. Bring whatever you own, though I'll warn you, space is limited." Martha's possessions fit into a single trunk. Her few dresses, a beloved book of poetry her father had given her, her mother's recipes written in faded ink, and a quilt she'd pieced together over the years. When Jeremiah saw the trunk, he simply nodded and loaded it into the wagon without comment about how little she had. That night, Martha stayed with the Reverend's wife, who clucked sympathetically over her situation. "Mountain men are a strange breed," Mrs. Matthews warned. "Hard men for a hard life. But Jeremiah Thornton has always been decent in his dealings with the town. He's never cheated anyone or broken his word, far as I know." "That's more than I can say for some so-called civilized men," Martha replied, thinking of her uncle. The journey into the mountains took 3 weeks. Jeremiah drove the wagon pulled by 2 sturdy mules, while Martha sat beside him on the bench. At first, they traveled in near silence, broken only by Jeremiah's occasional observations about the land or wildlife. But gradually, as the settlements fell away and they climbed into the wilderness, they began to talk. Jeremiah told her about his life, how he'd come west as a young man of 18, seeking adventure and freedom from his father's farm in Pennsylvania. He'd spent 20 years trapping beaver, learning the ways of the mountains, befriending various native tribes, and building his cabin at Bear Creek. "Why did you decide to marry now?" Martha asked one evening as they sat by their campfire. Jeremiah poked at the flames with a stick. "Came across a trapper last winter who'd frozen to death in his cabin. Found him 3 days after he passed. He'd been alone, like me. When he fell and broke his leg, there was nobody to help him, nobody to even know he was in trouble." He looked at her across the fire. "Made me think. I'm 42 years old, not a young man anymore. Seemed like maybe it was time to have another person around, someone to talk to, someone to notice if I don't come back from a hunt." "That's a practical reason for marriage," Martha observed. "You got better ones." She thought about it. "No, I suppose not. Mine are just as practical. I needed a home and you offered one. That's honest at least." Jeremiah nodded. "Honesty's about all I got to offer, Martha. That and a warm cabin and full belly if we work for it." On the 10th day of their journey, they encountered a group of Shoshone traders. Martha tensed, all the terrifying stories she'd heard about Indians flooding her mind. But Jeremiah raised his hand in greeting and called out in a language Martha didn't understand. The Shoshone leader, a man Jeremiah introduced as Running Elk, clasped Jeremiah's arm warmly. The two men spoke for several minutes before Running Elk turned to examine Martha with curious eyes. "He wants to know if you're my woman," Jeremiah translated. "I told him you're my wife." Running Elk spoke again, and Jeremiah actually laughed, a sound Martha hadn't heard from him before. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said you look strong enough to carry many children and survive hard winters. He said I chose well." Jeremiah's eyes met hers with something that might have been approval. The Shoshone value strength and endurance over fragile beauty. They think white men are fools for preferring women who look like they'd break in a strong wind. Martha felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "What did you tell him?" "That I agreed with him." They traded with the Shoshone, some of Jeremiah's steel knives for dried salmon and a beautifully beaded deerskin dress that Running Elk's wife insisted Martha accept as a wedding gift. That night, wearing the soft deerskin, Martha felt something shift inside her. Perhaps in this wild place, she could be valued for qualities that the civilized world had taught her to see as shameful. Chapter 3. Bear Creek. Martha's first sight of Jeremiah's cabin came on a bright morning in late August. They'd climbed to a high valley where a crystal stream tumbled down from the mountains, and there, in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, stood a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney. "It's not much," Jeremiah said, and Martha heard something unexpected in his voice. Nervousness, perhaps, or concern about her judgment. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. And it was. The cabin was solidly built, with real glass windows and a covered porch. Behind it stretched a large garden plot, and she could see a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a lean-to shelter for the mules. Jeremiah visibly relaxed. "Come on, I'll show you inside." The interior was dim and cool, one large room with a sleeping loft above. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Martha could see that Jeremiah had built sturdy furniture. A table, chairs, a bed frame, shelves. Everything was dusty and cluttered with the debris of a bachelor's existence, but the structure was sound. "I'll clean it up," Jeremiah said apologetically. "Haven't really kept it proper, living alone." Martha set down her bonnet and rolled up her sleeves. "We'll both clean it up. You said we were partners, remember?" They worked side by side for the rest of the day, and Martha found herself falling into an easy rhythm with her new husband. He didn't order her about or criticize her methods. Instead, they consulted on decisions, where to store what, how to organize the limited space, what repairs needed attention. By evening, the cabin had been transformed. Martha had scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and hung cheerful curtains from fabric she'd brought in her trunk. Jeremiah had repaired a wobbly chair and fixed a leak in the roof. Together, they'd made the cabin into something that felt, if not quite like home yet, at least like a place where home might take root. That first night, Martha lay awake in the loft, listening to Jeremiah's steady breathing from his bedroll by the fire. He'd insisted she take the bed, saying he was used to sleeping on the ground. She stared at the rough-hewn rafters above her head and tried to process the enormous change in her circumstances. 10 days ago, she'd been the unwanted burden in her uncle's house. Now she was a wife, the mistress of her own home, a partner to a man who seemed to value her strength rather than mock it. It seemed too good to be real, and she waited for the other shoe to drop, for Jeremiah to reveal himself as cruel or demanding or contemptuous. But as days turned into weeks, no such revelation came. Chapter 4. Building a Life. The work of survival in the mountains was endless and demanding, but Martha threw herself into it with an energy she'd never been permitted to use in her uncle's house. There, she'd been made to feel that her every movement was an imposition, that her appetite was shameful, that her very existence was a burden. Here, at Bear Creek, her strength was an asset. She learned to help Jeremiah haul water from the creek, carrying 2 full buckets without strain. She split firewood with an axe, building calluses on her hands and muscle in her arms. She worked in the garden, preparing it for winter and harvesting the last of the vegetables Jeremiah had planted in spring. She smoked fish and venison, rendered fat into tallow, and began accumulating stores for the winter Jeremiah warned would be brutal. "You're a natural at this," Jeremiah observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Some women I've known would have given up and demanded to be taken back to civilization by now." "Some women had something worth going back to," Martha replied. She paused, then added quietly, "This is the first place I've ever felt useful, valued." Jeremiah looked at her, his expression serious. "Your family didn't value you?" "My parents did when they were alive, but after they died of fever," she shrugged. "My uncle saw me as a burden, an embarrassment. He made it clear every day that he was doing me a charity by allowing me to live in his house and eat his food." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "Man's a fool." "Perhaps, but he wasn't entirely wrong. I am large. In civilized society, that's seen as a failing, a sign of gluttony or laziness or—" "Martha," Jeremiah's voice cut through her words, "you work harder than most men I've known. You're strong, capable, and smart. The size of your body don't change that. If anything, it makes you better suited for this life than some delicate thing who'd break under the strain." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She'd spent so many years absorbing her uncle's contempt, society's judgment, that hearing Jeremiah's matter-of-fact acceptance cracked something open inside her. "Thank you," she whispered. As autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson, Martha and Jeremiah fell into a comfortable partnership. They worked together, ate together, and in the evenings they talked. Jeremiah taught her about the mountains, how to read animal tracks, which plants were edible, how to predict weather by the behavior of birds. Martha read to him from her poetry book, and he listened with surprising attention, sometimes asking her to read a particular poem again. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Jeremiah brought up a subject they'd been carefully avoiding. "Martha, we need to talk about our sleeping arrangements." She looked up from the shirt she was mending, her heart suddenly pounding. They'd maintained separate sleeping areas since their wedding night, a situation that couldn't continue indefinitely, but which neither had been brave enough to address. "I won't force myself on you," Jeremiah continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "That ain't how I operate. But winter's coming, and it gets cold enough that sharing body heat is practical. More than that," he paused, struggling for words. "I've come to care for you, Martha, more than I expected. If you're willing, I'd like to be a proper husband to you, but if you're not, I'll respect that too." Martha set down her mending, her hands trembling slightly. Over the past 2 months, she'd developed her own unexpected feelings for this rough, kind man who never made her feel less than worthy. She'd come to appreciate his quiet strength, his dry humor, the way he asked her opinion rather than simply issuing orders. "I'm willing," she said softly. "I've come to care for you too, Jeremiah." He crossed the room and took her hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused palms. "Then let's be properly married, Martha Henderson Thornton." That night, they shared the bed in the loft for the first time, and Martha discovered that Jeremiah brought the same patience and consideration to intimacy that he brought to everything else. He was gentle, attentive, and when he held her afterward, she felt something she'd never experienced before, cherished. Chapter 5, Winter's Test. The winter of 1817 to 1818 was the harshest Jeremiah could remember in his 20 years in the mountains. Snow fell for days at a time, piling into drifts taller than a man. The temperature dropped so low that water left in a cup overnight froze solid. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, seeking any crack or gap to exploit. But inside the cabin, Martha and Jeremiah had created warmth. They worked as a team to maintain their survival. Each morning, Jeremiah would break a path through the snow to check his trap lines while Martha tended the fire and prepared breakfast. They'd learned each other's rhythms, could anticipate each other's needs. When Jeremiah came in half frozen from hunting, Martha had hot soup ready. When Martha's monthly courses left her cramping and miserable, Jeremiah prepared willow bark tea and took over the heavier chores without complaint. One particularly brutal week in January, they were snowed in completely. Jeremiah couldn't even make it to the smokehouse, let alone check his traps. They huddled by the fire, rationing their food, and Martha worried she saw concern in Jeremiah's eyes. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "We've got enough for another week, maybe 2 if we're careful," he admitted. "After that, I'll have to dig my way to the smokehouse no matter what the weather's doing." But Martha had been thinking, what about the loft? Could we access the smokehouse from above the snow? Jeremiah's eyes widened. We'd have to dig through the roof of the smokehouse, but he grabbed her face and kissed her soundly. "Martha, you're brilliant." Together, they executed her plan. Jeremiah dug up through the snow from the cabin's porch, creating a tunnel that opened above the drifts. From there, they could walk across the top of the snow. It had frozen solid enough to bear their weight, to the smokehouse. Jeremiah cut through the roof, and they were able to access their stores without fighting through the impossible drifts below. It worked. They survived the brutal week, and when the weather finally broke, they had enough food left to make it through the rest of the winter comfortably. That's twice you've saved us," Jeremiah said one evening. "First with the food preservation methods you taught me in the fall. We've got twice the stores I usually put by. And now with that tunnel idea." "We saved us," Martha corrected. "Partners, remember?" As winter slowly loosened its grip and signs of spring began to appear, Martha realized she'd missed her monthly courses. Once might be chance, but twice was significant. She waited another week, noting other signs, tender breasts, unusual fatigue, a heightened sense of smell, before she spoke to Jeremiah. "I think I'm with child," she said one morning as they ate breakfast. Jeremiah's spoon clattered into his bowl. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor, which we won't see for months anyway." For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then a smile spread across his bearded face, transforming his rough features. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, and Martha felt the last of her old fears dissolve. She'd been so afraid that pregnancy would make her even larger, even less attractive, that Jeremiah would regret choosing her. But the joy in his eyes was unmistakable. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Martha, I'm more than happy. I'm blessed." He kissed her forehead. "We'll need to build a cradle, and you'll need to take it easier. No more hauling heavy water buckets." "Jeremiah Thornton, I'm pregnant, not an invalid." "I know, but let me fuss a little. I've never been a father before." Chapter 6, Spring and Summer. As the snow melted and spring exploded across the high valley, Martha and Jeremiah prepared for the arrival of their child. Jeremiah proved to be hilariously overprotective, trying to prevent Martha from doing any heavy work until she firmly reminded him that pregnant women had been working throughout history without shattering like fine china. They compromised. Martha agreed not to lift anything extremely heavy or climb to dangerous heights. Jeremiah agreed to stop hovering like an anxious mother hen. In May, they had visitors, Running Elk and his extended family, traveling through on their way to summer hunting grounds. The Shoshone women examined Martha with expert eyes, felt her belly, and pronounced that she carried a strong child who would arrive when the leaves began to turn. Running Elk's wife, Willow Song, stayed behind for 3 days to teach Martha traditional birthing practices and prepare herbal remedies that would help with the delivery. She also taught Martha songs meant to ease the baby's passage into the world and gave her a beautifully beaded cradle board for the infant. "You are blessed," Willow Song told Martha through Jeremiah's translation. "Your husband looks at you with great love. Your child will be born into warmth and plenty." After the Shoshone departed, Martha found herself contemplating Willow Song's words. Love. Was that what had grown between her and Jeremiah? She'd been afraid to name it, afraid to hope for something beyond partnership and mutual respect. But watching Jeremiah work on the cradle he was building, sanding the wood until it was silk smooth, carving protective symbols into the headboard, testing and retesting the rockers to ensure they moved perfectly, she recognized the emotion for what it was. Jeremiah, she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, I love you. He turned to her, his blue eyes catching the last light of the sunset. I love you too, Martha. Think I have for months now, but I didn't want to presume. Didn't want you to feel obligated to say it back. Nothing about my feelings for you is obligation, she said firmly. You've given me a home, a purpose, and respect. You've made me feel beautiful for the first time in my life, not despite my body, but as I am. No, that's because you're beautiful, Jeremiah said simply. Strongest, most capable, kindest woman I've ever known. Our child is going to be lucky to have you as a mother. Summer brought long days of preparation. Martha preserved everything that could be preserved, knowing that caring for an infant would limit her work time once the baby arrived. She sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric that Jeremiah traded for during a trip to a distant trading post. She organized the cabin to accommodate a cradle, creating a space that would be warm but not too close to the fire. Jeremiah hunted and trapped with fierce dedication, building up their stores to excess. He reinforced the cabin's roof, chinked every gap in the walls, and laid in enough firewood to keep them warm through 2 winters. You're overdoing it, Martha observed, watching him stack yet another cord of wood. Want to make sure you and the baby have everything you need, he replied, not pausing in his work. We need you not to work yourself to death before the baby even arrives, she said tartly. Come inside and rest. He smiled at her bossy tone but obeyed, settling beside her at the table where she was shelling peas. They worked in comfortable silence, and Martha marveled again at how completely her life had transformed. A year ago, she'd been unwanted, unloved, convinced she would die a lonely spinster. Now she had a husband who loved her, a home of her own, and a child on the way. Chapter 7. The Birth. The baby arrived on a cool September evening, just as Willow Song had predicted. Martha's labor began in the afternoon, and Jeremiah transformed from calm mountain man to anxious wreck within minutes. Should I ride for help? He asked, pacing the cabin. Maybe I can reach the Shoshone. You will do no such thing, Martha said firmly between contractions. Women have been doing this since Eve. I have Willow Song's herbs, and I have you. That's enough. But as the hours wore on and the pain intensified, Martha began to wonder if she'd been overly confident. The contractions were brutal, rolling over her in waves that left her gasping. Jeremiah held her hand, wiped her forehead, and looked utterly terrified. You're doing so well, he kept saying. You're so strong, Martha. You can do this. Night fell. The contractions grew closer together, more intense. Martha walked, squatted, leaned against Jeremiah, trying every position Willow Song had taught her. Finally, as the moon rose high outside the window, she felt an overwhelming urge to push. The baby's coming, she gasped. Jeremiah helped her onto the bed they'd prepared with clean linens. His hands shook as he positioned himself to catch the baby, but his voice was steady as he coached her through each push. And then, with a final tremendous effort, their child entered the world. It's a boy, Jeremiah said, his voice choked with emotion. We have a son, Martha. The baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and indignant. Jeremiah cleaned him with trembling hands, tied off the cord, and placed the squalling infant on Martha's chest. Martha looked down at her son, red-faced, wrinkled, perfect, and felt love crash over her like an avalanche. Hello, little one, she whispered. Welcome to Bear Creek. Jeremiah collapsed beside the bed, his face wet with tears. You were amazing. You are amazing. Martha, I've never been so proud or so terrified in my life. We did it, Martha said, reaching for his hand. We made this little person together. They named him Daniel, after Jeremiah's father, and for the first few weeks their world narrowed to the confines of the cabin and the demands of their newborn son. Daniel was a healthy, hungry baby who seemed to grow bigger every day. Jeremiah was a surprisingly adept father, changing Daniel's cloths without complaint, walking him when he fussed, and staring at him for hours with an expression of wonder. Can't believe something so small came from us, he said one night, holding his sleeping son. Well, he won't stay small if he keeps eating like he does, Martha observed with a smile. He has quite an appetite. Gets that from both of us, Jeremiah said with a grin. As autumn progressed and Daniel grew, Martha and Jeremiah settled into their new routine as parents. It was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but it was also filled with moments of pure joy. Daniel's first smile, his delighted coos when Jeremiah made funny faces, the way he calmed instantly when Martha sang to him. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Daniel asleep in his cradle, Martha mending, Jeremiah carving a toy horse, Martha realized that she'd found something she'd never thought possible: complete happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Jeremiah asked, noticing her expression. "I'm thinking about that day in Independence, when I was the last woman standing," Martha said, "when you chose me out of all those others." "Best decision I ever made," Jeremiah said immediately. "The other women, the pretty ones, the delicate ones, they all got chosen first. For years I was rejected, passed over, made to feel worthless because of my size." She looked at him. "But if any of them had been chosen by you instead of me, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have this life, this love, this family." Jeremiah set down his carving and came to kneel beside her chair. "Martha, you listen to me. Those men who passed you over, they were fools. They couldn't see past society's narrow definition of beauty to recognize real worth. Their loss was my gain, and I thank God every day that you were still standing there when I arrived." "I thank God too," Martha whispered, "for all of it, for you seeing me when no one else would, for this wild, hard, beautiful life, for our son, for love I never thought I'd have." Jeremiah kissed her, gentle and sweet. "You deserve all of it and more." Chapter 8. The Years That Followed. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, the Thornton family's life at Bear Creek took on a comfortable rhythm. They worked hard, survived harsh winters, and celebrated brief summers, and built a life that was simple but rich with love. Word of their little homestead spread among the mountain men and trappers who passed through the region. More than one grizzled trapper commented on how well-maintained the Thornton place was, how healthy and happy the family seemed. Some brought news from civilization. Others brought trade goods or companionship for a few days. When Daniel was 2, Martha discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier. She knew what to expect, and Daniel provided delightful distraction from any discomfort. Their daughter Rose arrived in the spring of 1821, a tiny thing with Martha's dark hair and Jeremiah's blue eyes. "Now we've got one of each," Jeremiah said proudly, holding his daughter while Daniel climbed into Martha's lap for a cuddle. "Our family is complete, but the mountains had more surprises in store." 2 years later, Martha gave birth to twins, boys they named Samuel and Joseph. The cabin suddenly seemed much smaller with 5 people living in it, and Jeremiah spent the next summer building an addition that gave them 2 proper bedrooms. As the children grew, they thrived in the mountain environment. Daniel became his father's shadow, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Rose proved to have a gift for healing, using the herbs and remedies her mother taught her to tend scraped knees and upset stomachs. The twins, inseparable as always, were adventurous and clever, constantly finding new ways to explore their world. Martha watched her children grow with pride and occasional terror. The mountains were beautiful but dangerous, and she lived in constant awareness of the many ways she could lose them. But Jeremiah was a patient, careful teacher, and the children learned to respect the wilderness while loving it. In the summer of Daniel's 10th year, a group of missionaries passed through, offering to take any children back to St. Louis for proper schooling. Martha and Jeremiah discussed it seriously. They wanted their children to have opportunities, to learn more than their parents could teach them. But when they presented the option to the children, the response was unanimous and immediate. "This is our home," Daniel said firmly. "We don't want to leave." Ma teaches us reading and writing and sums," Rose added. "And Pa teaches us everything about the mountains. What more do we need?" The twins just shook their heads vigorously, clinging to Martha's skirts. "Well," Jeremiah said, meeting Martha's eyes over their children's heads, "I guess that settles that." As years passed, Martha and Jeremiah's hair turned gray. Their movements slowed, but their love deepened. They'd built something remarkable in their mountain valley, not just a homestead, but a legacy. Their children would grow up knowing they were wanted, valued, and loved exactly as they were. Epilogue, full circle. On a warm summer evening in 1835, Martha sat on the porch of the expanded cabin, now quite large, with the additions Jeremiah had built over the years, and watched her grandchildren play in the yard. Daniel had married a Shoshone woman, and their 3 children were visiting. Rose, at 14, was teaching her young nieces to braid flower crowns. The twins, 12 now, were demonstrating their tracking skills to their nephew. Jeremiah settled into the chair beside her with a contented sigh. He was 60 years old now, his beard more silver than black, but his blue eyes still sparkled when he looked at her. "Remember when it was just us?" he asked, taking her hand. "I remember being terrified," Martha admitted, "terrified that this was all too good to be true, that I'd wake up and find myself back in my uncle's house, unloved and unwanted." And now? Martha surveyed her kingdom, the thriving garden, the sturdy buildings, the children and grandchildren who filled the valley with laughter. "Now I know that sometimes the best things in life come from being chosen last. If I'd been picked first at that bride auction, I might have ended up with some farmer who wanted a servant, not a partner. I might never have known real love or built this life." "God works in mysterious ways," Jeremiah observed. "Indeed he does." Martha squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Jeremiah, for seeing me when no one else would, for choosing me, for loving me." "Thank you for saying yes," Jeremiah replied, "for taking a chance on a rough old mountain man, for building this life with me." He paused, then added with a grin, "and for being strong enough to carry water buckets, split firewood, and birth 4 babies without breaking a sweat." Martha laughed, the sound rich and joyful. Well, someone had to be the practical one in this family. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Martha reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd spent so many years believing that her body made her unworthy of love, that she was a burden, that she would never belong anywhere. But here, in this wild place with this rough, kind man and the family they'd built together, she'd found her truth. She was exactly who she was meant to be, and she was loved not despite her size, but as herself, completely, wholly, and without reservation. Nobody had wanted her for 10 years, until Jeremiah Thornton chose her from among 30 women and gave her a life beyond anything she dared to dream. And that had made all the difference.